Hey folks, how you doing? Eric Eulis here for yet another discussion about DB Cooper and really the fascinating mystery and enigma of the guy, and frankly what the hell I'm doing about it, trying to figure out who this guy was 53 years out. So today I want to be very quick, very briefly talk about something related to DB Cooper's tie that isn't there. Something that isn't there that one would expect to be there, that I think is a very big clue and is a very big piece of the puzzle. And here's what I'm talking about. Let me throw up a picture right now. There it is, ladies and gentlemen, the culprit. The one thing that we have yet to find on DB Cooper's tie, yet it kind of should be. What do you think it is? It's asbestos. That's right, asbestos. The crystallized, fibrous, spiny, spiky little creatures. They're not really creatures, but things that were used early on in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the construction, in a lot of places like steel mills and factories and so forth that dealt in particular with high heat and molten metals and things of that nature. And Crucible in particular, the company where I think DB Cooper came from, Crucible Steel of America, these guys were sued a lot by former employees that ended up getting basically mesothelioma and other, asbestos-related diseases, years later because their exposure to asbestos was significant. And again, this was from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, it's worth considering that Crucible had a number of facilities in the Northeast. They had facilities in Pennsylvania, they had facilities in New Jersey, they had facilities in New York. So there were a number of facilities there. And if you look at those facilities and the places that had problems with asbestos, it really comes down to several that related to areas where they produced on a commercial level steel and iron and things of that nature, kind of on a big grand commercial scale that they ultimately sold, shipped out the door and sold to places. So it's the workers that worked in those large factories, those large facilities that had the big urns and furnaces and all that shit going on there. Those are the places that these guys ended up contracting mesothelioma as a byproduct of asbestos. Now, asbestos was ultimately outlawed, I want to say like in the 1980s, before that stuff was finally done with. But again, up until the 1980s, again, 50s, 60s, 70s in particular, man, this shit was a major fucking problem for a lot of people there, and it did a lot of damage. And there have been literally thousands of people who work for Crucible who ultimately sued the company. Now, why is this important? It's important for this reason, and I think this reason kind of alone. DB Cooper's tie didn't have any of that shit on it. It had no asbestos on the tie. I mean, we found all kinds of stuff: titanium, commercially pure titanium, zinc, zirconium, uranium, rare earth elements, bentonite clay, salt, all kinds of shit on DB Cooper's tie, but no asbestos. And that's the one thing coming from that world, that space, that universe, that you would expect to find on DB Cooper's tie. In fact, all of DB Cooper's clothing. Because when that asbestos is floating around in the air, and it is floating around in the air, when they got to replace gaskets and tiles in ceilings and bricks and other equipment and things that have asbestos parts and pieces and elements to it, that stuff starts floating around, and that's where the problem begins. And as you recall from the picture, it's sort of nasty shit. That hooks into your lungs, and that creates big problems, cancers, all kinds of diseases and problems. But also when it hooks into your clothes, it doesn't let go. It's not as simple as just throwing that shit in the washer, washing it out, and you're good to go. In fact, DB Cooper's tie, as a side note, doesn't appear that it was ever washed, because there's all kinds of shit on DB Cooper's tie from the workplace. So again, why is it? Why is it that we have never found any asbestos on DB Cooper's tie? And why is that important? Let me tell you right now. Okay, let's look at the facilities that have had problems. Let's look at the Crucible facilities that have had problems with asbestos. We've had a big problem in the Syracuse facility. They had a big problem in the Rochester facility. They had a big problem in the Midland, Pennsylvania facility. And they had a big problem at their Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania facility, not to be confused with the Robinson Township facility. The Robinson Township facility is where they had the Hunter Research Lab, which is where I believe D.B. Cooper came from. In fact, it's where my primary person of interest, Vince Peterson, came from, the Hunter Research Lab. And the reason why is because the facility there in Robinson Township, which didn't have the same problems, it's not to suggest they didn't have any asbestos in there, because to be sure they did, but it's a research lab. It's a research lab, so they weren't dealing with the same sort of things that they were dealing with at the other facilities. Specifically, with the Hunter Research Lab, they had one part of the building that had, engineers and metallurgists and so forth, working in labs and Bunsen burners and all that kind of stuff, experimenting, creating shit. And then on the other end of the facility, you had a machine shop, that was, cold pressing and drilling and pulling and testing out strength and all kinds of things there. Now, my understanding is they did have a small sort of, foundry, I guess, related to it, where they could create small prototype quantities of particular alloys and things for the purpose of testing or whatever. So they did have a very small operation as far as that is concerned. But again, nothing on the level, the grand commercial level that you saw at the other facilities. So I think that goes a long ways towards explaining why somebody could work at Crucible and not be exposed to asbestos apparently at all, or at least very, very small amount. The other really important thing to consider here is that when you're talking about those other facilities, the commercial facilities, the bigger ones, those buildings were very old. Many from the early 1900s, late 1800s. The equipment was old. And it's when stuff has to be replaced and parts of machinery and parts of buildings and things have to be replaced or modified or whatever, that's when the asbestos comes out and gets in the air and kind of fucks things up for people there. Now, the Robinson Township facility, the Hunter Research Lab, was built only in 1964. It was brand spanking new in 1964. And you know what else was built in 1964? You got it. D.B. Cooper's tie was built in 1964. Now, this is exactly like D.B. Cooper's tie. Exact same lot. Everything's exactly the same, except one thing, the obvious, the color's different. D.B. Cooper's tie was pure black. This is obviously not pure black, but even this alligator tie clip is exactly the same as D.B. Cooper's. So, but that's a very important thing to remember. It's very important to consider that the Robinson Township facility was a brand new facility. So even though certainly there were some areas that had asbestos in them, because it was a brand new building and brand new equipment or whatever, it didn't have the opportunity the way the much older buildings did for this stuff to be floating around and that kind of thing. And D.B. Cooper in all likelihood bought that tie in 64, probably wore it 4 or 5 years before he upgraded to, something a little bit more stylish, a little bit more wider, a little more bolder, a little bit more neon colored, something a little more 1970s-ish. So you've got 4 or 5 years, a brand new facility, brand new tire, whatever. The guy's an engineer, he's not really working around furnaces and stuff like that. He is doing some bouncing between the research lab and obviously the shop, which is drilling and doing all that kind of stuff, cold pressing stuff. But that's a very different world than, again, to repeat myself, what we saw at those other facilities. So I think it's that lack of asbestos on D.B. Cooper's tie that I think tells a really big part of the story and is a critical piece of evidence. I think it points specifically, and as far as I know, exclusively to the Hunter Research Lab as part of Crucible Steel of America's properties. I'm unaware of any other place that would really kind of have the same sort of thing when you consider all of the stuff that was taking place there, because it's not just that. There was a number of other things, research on titanium powder metallurgy, research on various titanium alloys and things of that nature, all stuff that, again, that appears to be on D.B. Cooper's tie. That's all stuff that points me squarely at the Hunter Research Lab there. So it's that lack of something that you would otherwise expect that I think is a very critical piece of evidence. See, it's more than just simply looking at the tie and saying, yo, we got all the shit on the tie, and where does D.B. Cooper come from to pick up all this stuff? That's really important. It helps us out a lot. But I also think it's very, very important to look at what's not on the tie, what you would kind of expect to be on the tie, and ask the question, why? If it's not on the tie, Ask the question why. I kind of like that. So there you go. I think that's a very important thing to consider. No asbestos on DB Cooper's tie. And in my mind, my book, that tells us that DB Cooper, in all likelihood, came from the Hunter Research Lab, Robinson Township, suburbs of Pittsburgh, working in the Titanium Research Lab, or very, very close. There we go. So that's all I've got for you today right now, folks. As usual, any comments or questions, shoot me an email, eric@ericulis.com. And until next time, folks, cheers.